spine-chilling Tale from the Crypt.
Sometimes it seems to me almost as if every really old building has stories of hauntings and ghostly apparitions attached to it. Hampton Court Palace is a perfect example of the sort of thing I'm talking about. In fact, if only a very small fraction of the stories about the palace are true, it would seem to be almost impossible to walk around the place without bumping into at least one ghostly spectre or other. After Cardinal Wolsey, who built the palace, fell from grace and died in the Tower of London, Henry VIII moved in and lived there with 5 of his 6 wives. Not all at once, of course. Not even Henry was that randy. One of the wives who spent some time at Hampton Court was Catherine Howard, though her stay was rather short. She married Henry in 1540 when she was a beautiful 18-year-old. She was executed for adultery just 2 years later, in February 1542. 3 months before her execution, she was imprisoned in her own apartments in Hampton Court, and it was from those apartments in the November of 1541 that she managed to make a brief escape. She broke away from her guards and ran screaming down what is now called the Haunted Gallery to the King's private chapel, where the obese and diseased king was praying. Screaming for mercy, she hammered on the door of the chapel, but her bloated and heartless husband ignored her pleas, and she was dragged, still screaming, back to her private chambers, which she was never to leave until her appointment with the headsman on Tower Green. Catherine's ghost has been seen and heard many times, but the experience of Baroness von Kovach seems to have been terrifyingly unique. In the 1950s, the Baroness lived in one of the so-called Grace and Favour apartments in the palace. These are small flatlets where the widows of important crown servants can live free of charge as a reward for their husband's services. Baroness Kovach's apartment opened onto the Haunted Gallery. For several weeks, her rest had been disturbed by the sound of footsteps passing her door at midnight. Night after night, she'd heard first the tapping of a woman's high-heeled shoes passing her door and heading towards the king's staircase. After a moment's silence would come the sound of the dragging footsteps of an old and infirm man shuffling after the woman. Baroness von Kovach talked to many people both inside and outside the palace, but no one she asked could offer her any explanation of the unearthly midnight footsteps. Finally, the intrepid Baroness decided to discover the truth for herself, and to watch in the hope that the owners of the spectral feet were visible as well as audible. Consequently, she left her door slightly ajar, and turning out the lights, placed herself in such a position that she could observe the corridor without being seen. Sure enough, as midnight approached, just as on previous nights, she heard the hurried tap, tap, tap of the woman's shoes coming from the distance towards her room. Despite her understandable fear, she remained in her place, and soon made out a faint light approaching along the corridor. The light seemed to be a luminous cloud, which surrounded the figure of a small woman who seemed to emanate an aura of terror. The woman continued her frightened way to the king's staircase, where the vision faded from view. The ensuing silence was, if anything, more terrifying than the sound of the footsteps. With pounding heart, the Baroness continued her solitary vigil. After what seemed to her to be an eternity, she heard, coming slowly down the corridor, the strange, almost bestial shuffling footsteps. She suddenly shivered as the air became icy around her, while the steps passed within 3 feet of where she watched. Straining her eyes in the gloom, she saw only a black, shapeless shadow moving along the gallery. She could see nothing clearly, but As the figure drew level with her, she almost choked on the sudden rotting stench of an open grave. The dragging footsteps continued to the top of the king's staircase, then faded into silence. So Baroness von Kovac still didn't know the answer to the phantom walkers. In fact, perhaps only one person ever did find out the secret of the king's staircase. But that, as they say, is another story, and one which I'll tell you the next time you visit me here at the mausoleum.
There'll be another terrifying tale from the crypt soon, if not sooner.